Just about every great comic book story has a darkest hour moment. A point in the tale where all seems lost, the heroes are on their knees, the city's a smoldering ruin, and the villains are closing in for the kill. For Marvel, its darkest hour came in the winter of 1996. Timely's first comic book was Marvel Comics #1, cover dated October 1939, which featured several superhero characters, most notably the Human Torch and the Submariner. Timely Comics introduced many superhero characters during comics' golden age in the 1940s, most importantly Captain America, who first appeared in Captain America Comics #1, March 1941. As the 1940s ended, superheroes fell out of vogue with the comic book readers. In 1956, rival company DC Comics ushered in the so-called Silver Age of comics by reintroducing superhero titles with significant commercial success. By early 1960s, Atlas changed its name to Marvel Comics. For several decades, Marvel and DC were the top companies in the industry. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Marvel changed hands numerous times, becoming a publicly held company in 1991. A company that had grown in stature throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s thanks to the often stunning art and storytelling in such comics as Fantastic Four and The Amazing Spider-Man, Marvel's financial success was incredible. But then a series of bursting financial bubbles and questionable business deals. In all of the past decades, the only source of income for Marvel were selling comic books. In 1993, while Marvel and the comics industry were enjoying their success, Sandman writer Neil Gaiman stood before about 3,000 retailers and gave a speech which few in attendance wanted to hear. In it, he argued that the success of the comic book market for high guaranteed returns, Gaiman said. But you're selling bubbles and tulips, and one day the bubble will burst and the tulips will rot in the warehouse. The bubble Gaiman described had begun several years earlier, when comic books, once considered disposable pulp by parents, were becoming prized items by collectors who'd grown up with their favorite superheroes as kids. But the toy biz snapped up a couple of trading card companies, panini stickers, and a distribution outfit, Heroes World. All told, those acquisitions cost Marvel a reported $700 million. Through the early 90s, Marvel was buoyed by the success of such comics as Spider-Man and X-Men, which were selling in huge numbers. Sales of a new book, X-Force, were similarly huge, thanks in part to a cunning sales gimmick. If collectors wanted to get hold of all 5 cards, they had to buy multiple copies of the same comic. With the boom still in full swing, that's exactly what collectors did. Then, just as Gaiman predicted, the bubble burst. Between 1993 and 1996, revenues from comics and trading cards began to collapse. Suddenly, Marvel, which at one point seemed invincible as it grew in size, now looked decidedly vulnerable. When the business turned, observed then chairman and CEO of Marvel, Scott Sassa, it was like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Some in the industry went further and argued that Perelman's tactics had endangered the entire industry. The idea was very simple. Once Perelman had enough sales in place when the boom was still in the early stage and raked in huge profits, he then took Marvel public, selling 40% of its stock for vastly more than what he paid for the entire company. At Marvel Studios, a venture which he hoped would finally get the company's most famous characters on the big screen after years of legal disputes. To do this, he planned to buy the remaining shares in Toy Biz and merge it with Marvel, creating a single, stronger entity. Marvel's shareholders' response was to file for bankruptcy, thus giving him the power to reorganize Marvel without the stockholders' consent. There followed a bewildering power struggle which raged for almost 2 years. After a lengthy court case, Toy Biz and Marvel Entertainment Group were finally merged. But Perelman and his nemesis Ekan were both ousted in the process. They installed the 55-year-old Joseph Calamari, who'd been at the helm of Marvel in the 80s, as its new CEO. Marvel's entry into movies. With the financial intrigue in the boardroom settling down, Marvel began to turn its attention to a target it had been trying to hit since the 1980s, the movie business. For years, Marvel had struggled to get its properties onto the big screen, to what was right in front of them, he said. Things began to change in the late 90s, when Marvel began to find its feet again. Blade was a hit, and X-Men finally began to move ahead at Fox. Pickings for Marvel, however, were slim. Blade made $70 million at the box office, but the reward for Marvel, according to a Slate article, was a measly $25,000. Shortly after the deal with Merrill Lynch went through, Marvel announced that Iron Man would be its first independent production. Finally, a character who'd languished in development hell since the 1990s was finally getting a shot at big screen stardom. Marvel continued to blossom. Iron Man made $585 million, kickstarting a cinematic universe that is still only just unfolding. The next turning point came in 2009, when Disney purchased Marvel for a dizzying $4.3 billion. Marvel's track record over the past 6 years seems to bear a rod out. The Avengers alone made billions, and currently ranks as the 6th highest grossing film of all time, bringing in a whopping $1.5 billion worldwide. Iron Man 3 became the 5th Marvel film to gross more than $1 billion. Even a quirky film like Guardians of the Galaxy, a space opera some regarded as a gamble, made more than $750 million.